So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Metaphysical Bible Hangout. I am Reverend Sherri James. I am Senior Minister for Understanding Principles Church, and I am excited to be here this evening. This is a powerful conversation that we're having. We are in the midst of looking at the Hebrew Scriptures, and we're looking to see what is actually in our Bible. So if you have found this broadcast, perhaps there is something happening in your soul as we speak that wants you to know what is in the Hebrew Scriptures. And so this is a student's guide to the Hebrew Scriptures written by one of my teachers, the late Reverend Dr. Mary Ann Tumpkin. And what she's done in this text is she's actually taken the latest Bible scholarship and put it in a workbook form. So this isn't necessarily her research, it's curated research. I feel like I should say that to somebody so you guys know that. What I'm giving you is something that you can get or that you would get if you were in a seminary course. And it's been a conviction of mine since I first learned this Bible scholarship that it be something that's taken out and taught to the masses, that everybody should know about our Bible. They should know about the human fingerprints all over the Bible. And I don't see that as a shaker of faith. I don't see that as a reason to lessen your faith, but in actuality to strengthen it. Because when you get into the story and you take all of the doctrine off of it, what you find is this beautiful relationship of these ancient peoples trying to relate to this presence known by various names: Jehovah Shammah, Jehovah Jireh, Jehovah Shalom, Jehovah Sidkenu, Yahweh, so just by many different names, Elohim, and those names for God were they were the ways that these people understood God, that they began to know God as a provider. They began to know God as a source of peace. They began to know God as a teacher, as a healer. So all of those things I think are important, because I don't see our technology may be different, our worldview may be different. You know, they had a worldview where the world was flat and there were pillars that held up the sky and all of that. And our worldview is different because we've had space travel. We've gone to the moon. I just read a book to Jordan last night about what the moon is like. And I didn't know this. Maybe y'all did, but did you know there have been 12 missions to the moon? Like 12 separate missions, successful missions to the moon. And that's just what we talk about in the U.S. Forget what's going on in other countries that are also doing space travel. So we have a different cosmology, and yet something in the soul needs to know God. Something in the soul needs to know. We have this sense that there is something more than what we are personally experiencing in our everyday physical lives. So that's for me what is so powerful about this study. Now, today we're going to get into a conversation of Joshua and Judges. So we have come through the full Pentateuch from Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And now we're about to turn our attention to Joshua and the Judges. And this is a really interesting period in Israel's history, because it's almost like a transitional period between the death of Moses and the rise or the emergence of the monarchy. And there are some interesting things that are happening here, not just in the stories, but then also perhaps in the actual context, because the stories aren't necessarily the literal truth of what happens of what happened with the people. All right, I'm going to toggle between a few different things here. I've got the PowerPoint, but I also have notes here that I'm working with. I've got stuff in Evernote, and I got handwritten notes. So if y'all could flow with me, we can get this going. All right, so let's just take a moment to just relax. We want to open everything that we do in prayer. And so if you could just relax right where you are and recognize that there is only one power and there is only one presence. That power, that presence is God, the good, omnipotent, the everywhere, evenly present spirit of absolute good. This beautiful spirit of absolute good indwells us. It breathes itself as us. It is the truth of who we are. And so we just speak to that presence now, and we ask for guidance in understanding this lesson and how to incorporate it into our lives. Help make this material relevant so that we live better lives. We don't just want information, we want edification. We don't just want knowledge, we want wisdom. We want the application of this information in our lives. And so I thank you, Spirit, because I know you answer every prayer that I pray. And so I know that the right way to make use of what you have given us will reveal itself through this conversation. In the name and the nature of the one that is called the Christ, we affirm that it is so, and so it is. And amen. All right, so let me pull up the PowerPoint here. What's going on here? Okay, so the book of Joshua is the story of how the Israelites entered the land of Canaan in order to create a homeland. It is the story of how the Israelites entered the land of Canaan. Now, some things that I want to bring up, because I want to bring this back to the forefront of your mind. So last time we talked about this idea of Israel being God's choice. Israel being God's choice. And Israel is a chosen one. And we get this for the first time in the book of Deuteronomy. And so we were talking about the fact that Deuteronomy, that for Deuteronomy, the election of Israel, or God's election of Israel, means or entails the idea that Israel is a holy people, holy in the sense that they are separated to God. The root meaning of holiness, it means to be separated from the common, from the ordinary. We made the distinction between holy and profane. That which is holy is that which has been set apart. Profane doesn't mean profane in the way that we use it in modern day English. Profane simply means common, meaning everyday use. And so for this reason, intermarriage with the Canaanites is prohibited in Deuteronomy. And this is going to matter. So I want you to hold this in mind. And what you get in Deuteronomy is this idea that the Canaanites are to be utterly destroyed, and all alien practices are to be removed from the covenant community, meaning the people that are the community that is in covenant with Yahweh. So now, given that there are no Canaanites at the time of Deuteronomy's composition, meaning at the time that Deuteronomy was actually being written, some scholars believe that this text is actually some type of like internal dialogue that's happening in the Israelite society whose practices didn't conform to Deuteronomy's Yahweh only policy or Yahweh only ideals. And so this is an idea that we're going to come back to, but I want you to just hold on to that. Separation entails separation to God's service, not just separation to God, but also being in service to God. And so when we talk about the Hebrew community observing God's laws, these laws of purity, the rejection of pagan practices, all of this is a privilege because you've been chosen or singled out. Maybe the best way that we could describe it would be the royal family. We don't, in the U.S., we don't have royalty, but I think we understand the concept of royalty. We've watched movies. We got the movie Downton Abbey coming out. And so we've seen this idea of like the elite class. And if you watch that show, if you watch anything of like a show that highlighted the monarchy, you know that there were all of these rules and regulations for what it meant and like how things are done and things that you can't do. Part of what made Fergie is that she went against royal protocol, that there's this way that you do things. And if you buck royal tradition, the queen is going to come down on you, and you may be, I don't know if it's excommunicated, but you certainly won't be welcome at the family dinner. So if you could think of it that way, that Israel has been chosen by God, this idea is put forth in Deuteronomy. And the thing is, and I'm bringing this up because many of us have been raised in Christian traditions, and we have been taught that the law was backbreaking, that it was onerous, that it was legalistic, and that Jesus was coming to rail against it. And so we have had this very Christocentric view, I don't know if that's the right way to say it, but it basically our view of Jewish law or Israelite law was that it was something negative and punishing. But I want you to get really that that's not how that community saw it. They saw it as a privilege because they were chosen or singled out, being a holy people to God. And so since they were singled out or chosen, then that had some special obligations and responsibilities. And they were proud to live up to those obligations and those responsibilities. So what happens in Joshua chapter 1 is that Joshua assumes leadership. Leadership is what goes in that blank. I'm at the top of page 46. Leadership. Joshua assumes leadership of the Israelites after Moses' death. After Moses' death, Joshua assumes leadership of the Israelites. And remember what I said last time, that Moses is a what's the word I want to use? Like I can't get my words right. Let me turn back to the page where I said it. He paradigmatic. Moses is a paradigmatic leader. And so if you remember, Moses sent out 2 spies to look at the promised land. And then here you have Joshua sending out 2 spies. A lot of times in this book, you're going to see Joshua doing the same things that Moses did, because again, Moses becomes like a paradigm of what prophet leadership is supposed to look like. And so later prophets get painted in light of Moses, and they almost take the same actions, or they assign the same actions. Doesn't mean that the character didn't do it, but perhaps he did it because Moses did it. So Joshua sends 2 spies into Jericho to investigate the city before the battle. Joshua sends 2 spies into Jericho to investigate the city before the battle, and a harlot named Rahab assisted them. And this is what you find in Joshua chapter 2. A harlot named Rahab assisted them. Now the Israelites crossed the Jordan River, and they went to Gilgal, where all the men were circumcised. They went to Gilgal, where all the men were circumcised. And this is what's happening in chapters 3 through 5. Chapters 3 through 5. All of them are circumcised. And again, this is in keeping with the Deuteronomic or Deuteronomistic, sometimes it's said both ways, of understanding of the Mosaic law. And so circumcision is a part of that they are conforming to the Mosaic law. And this is important because the belief is that the possession of the promised land is tied to the strict observance of the laws of Yahweh. The possession of the promised land is tied to the strict observance of the promises of Yahweh. And if you could get that this book is like its final form comes about while they are in the post-exile period, or maybe during the exile period. So they are exiled at this point to Babylon, and they are put in service of the government. The temple has been destroyed. And one of the things that was specific to the school of Deuteronomy, or the Deuteronomistic school, or whatever name you want to give to it, is this idea of centralizing the worship in one place. So you get the idea from the other books that there's really not as much of a button on worshiping in other places. You don't get the same polemics that you get in Deuteronomy that are speaking against the other shrines of Baal and whatever and talking against them. You don't really get that in the book of Deuteronomy. You don't really get that in Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. But when you get to Deuteronomy, you get this this almost wholesale polemic against those types of worship, and it's temple only worship or tabernacle only worship. And so this book is composed during the time of the exile, and you get the sense that it's almost like this internal dialogue of trying to explain, like, how is it that if we're God's chosen people, we could have lost our homeland? And the reasoning is that there was not a strict observance to the law of God. And so having land was tied to the observance of God's laws. And if you violate those laws, then it's almost like Yahweh is going to vomit you out of the land. And so every place where you see a violation, it's always about they turned away from God, and so then they lost God's protection. They turned away from God, and you'll see this over and over and over again. The Israelites attacked Jericho, and they were successful. The Israelites attacked Jericho, and they were successful. Jonathan says, does the focus on centralized worship somehow tie into the first commandment to have no other gods before me? Yes, it does, but it is in Deuteronomy that you get this hard line, don't even tolerate the worship of other gods even in your land anywhere. You don't really get that so much in Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Genesis. You don't really get that so much. In Deuteronomy, it is a hard line. And so there's no intermarriage, because you might end up worshiping the God of your spouse. Don't let, there's kindness. If you remember last time I talked about the humanistic angle on Deuteronomy, it's very interested in kindness to foreigners, but don't be getting married with them. You be nice to them, but you do not marry them, because marrying them, you run the risk of what they call syncretism, that your practices might sync up. So they're going to rub off on you, and you're going to rub off on them. But the worst part is that they rub off on you. One of the Israelites, Achan, stole some of the property during the Battle of Jericho. One of the Israelites, Achan, is the character name, Achan. He stole some of the property during the Battle of Jericho. Because of his disobedience, the Israelites lost the Battle of Ai the first time. Achan was discovered and punished, and afterward, the second Battle of Ai was successful. And you find punished, he was put to death. This is in Joshua chapter 7 and 8. So a couple of things here. One is the notion of sin, because the text talks about not him personally, but talks about sin, and sin is collective. Sin is collective. It wasn't like the idea of individualized sin doesn't come until much, much later. At this point, sin is something that is collective. And so they had to root out the member of the community that had sinned, because they were basically defiling the entire community. They were defiling the entire community. That Yahweh had given a very specific command about how they were supposed to go in and possess the land. So him stealing was a violation of the laws of Yahweh, and so he's essentially defiled not just himself, but defiled the group. And so the only way to deal with him really is punishment by death, as far as this community is concerned. So this disobedience was considered a collective disobedience. So if they had not killed him, they would be endangering the future prosperity and sanctification of the entire community. That we can't let you continue, because you're messing it up for everybody. And so, you doing wrong means effectively we don't get rid of you. All of us have done wrong. And so they kill him. They get rid of him. The other thing that I want to give is Israel sold some of the property. It's collective. Oh, this idea of being able to possess the land and strict adherence to the laws of Yahweh. That not allowing that to stand, not ferreting out what was the cause of them losing the battle, and not figuring that out, or where the sin was or where the mistake was, would mean that they would not be able to possess the land. So this was being able to take advantage of what God has singled them out for. He singled them out as a chosen people, as a peculiar people, as his own treasure. It was a spontaneous act of love from God toward Israel. And so they could potentially mess that up if they had not solved that. And so sin was about making sure, not sinning was about making sure that you were able to have what God had for you. And in this case, it was land. The Gibeonites are a group that so what was happening was that the Israelites were extremely successful, and they were going in, except for, say, that Battle of Ai, they were just knocking down territory after territory after territory. And what happens is the Gibeonites hear of them coming, and they actually strike a deal and strike a covenant with Israel, that they won't attack them. And the Israelites honor that covenant. And so the Gibeonites are basically able to continue without being killed, basically. I want to find this part. So this is in chapter 9. The Gibeonites joined, they were a local group. And what ends up happening is that they make a deal with them. They make a deal with them and they trick them. They trick them into making a covenant with them. But the Israelites, if they make a covenant, they honor the covenant. And so even though the Gibeonites tricked them into making the covenant, they decide to go ahead and honor that covenant. And so it is, they keep going with it, even though they were tricked into doing it. Now, although many territories were not taken, this is Joshua chapter 13, Joshua divided the conquered areas among the tribes, and you'll see this in chapters 14 through 19, and designated cities of refuge. So territories goes in that blank. I'm at the bottom of 46 and top of 47. Although many territories were not taken, Joshua divided the conquered areas among the tribes and designated cities of refuge. Designated cities of refuge. Okay. If you go to the next blank, it says that the Levites were given towns, but no tribal lands. The Levites were given towns, but no tribal lands. And that's what goes in that blank, towns, but no tribal land. And it says the tribes settled in their territories. So when they're speaking of the tribes, they're talking of the 12 tribes that come out of the land of Egypt. There are a couple of different lists, excuse me, I can't get my words together. There are a couple of different lists of the tribes that are out there, but they are the tribes of Gad, Asher. I'm not going to remember all of these by heart. But they settle into the land and begin to do the work of taking care of the land and living on the land. And one of the things that's interesting is that they're always fighting amongst themselves. This is a constant thing. They actually don't get united for a very long time. They are constantly fighting among themselves. If you look at number 10, it says that Joshua gathered the people at Shechem for his final address and for covenant renewal. Joshua gathered the people at Shechem for his final address and for covenant renewal. And so what happens in this part with Shechem, hold on, covenant. I'm going through my notes, so excuse me for a second on this. So the account of the conquest in Joshua 2 through 12 is concerned to express the basic idea that Israel's victories would not have been possible without Yahweh, without Yahweh's wondrous help. And it was Yahweh who divided the Jordan before them. It was Yahweh who broke down the walls of Jericho. It was Yahweh who put fear in the hearts of the Canaanites. Yahweh was present at every battle. And the ark was a visible sign of his presence, and it marched before them. And soon after the conquest, representatives of all of the tribes of Israel are going to meet, and they make this solemn covenant at Shechem to be the people of Yahweh. So this is that part in the story where Joshua says, choose you this day. I don't know if Joshua 23:15, choose you this day whom you're going to serve. So essentially what's happening is he's recounting all the ways that Yahweh has basically made all of this possible. The reason that we could be successful, the reason that we could conquer, come into this land, that it wasn't by our might that this happened, that it was by Yahweh's might, by God's might that this happened. And the ark, which was this visible sign of God's presence, that it marched before them and it made the conquest possible. So then when they get to Shechem, what they are doing is that they are renewing the covenant that was laid down in Deuteronomy by Moses. There is this commitment to be the people of Yahweh and to worship Yahweh alone. So when scholars think about Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and those stories, they consider them part of the same school of thought, because there is this hard line insistence on the worship of Yahweh only. I also want you to get that these books, the time period that they write about, is centuries earlier than when the book was actually written. It is like by 600 or 700 years earlier. So it would be like us sitting and writing a story, excuse me, us sitting and writing the story of how the peoples of African descent who came to this country, how they survived. And let's say that we were going to attribute that to honoring God. And the reason that Harriet Tubman could do what she did, and the reason that Frederick Douglass could do what he did, and the reason that, and we all attributed all of that to God. Therefore, what we need to do today is follow the practice of our ancestors who, because they worship God and God alone, we sit here today. So I want you to get this context, because again, we've been taught to take the Bible as if it's an eyewitness account, meaning that the moment something happens, somebody's writing it down on a piece of papyrus. And that's not how these stories came together. These stories came together over many centuries. They were first passed down orally, and later they were put down on papyrus and preserved. But this is centuries after the actual events happened. So, you know, you think about how accurate you would be if you wrote a story about slavery. You would have to try to take your modern sensibility and put it back into the mind of a Harriet Tubman or a Marcus Garvey or Phyllis Wheatley, or, you know, you'd have to go back and try to put your 21st century mind that understands that you can travel to the moon. I mean, flight wasn't even possible, that you could fly across the ocean to another country. You would have to take that understanding and squish it back down to 17th century, 16th century America, coming to this country where the mode of transportation is horse, buggy, and boat. I'm trying to draw some parallels here because I want you to get that these human fingerprints are all over. It doesn't change the spiritual truth in the text, but I think you need to know what's in the text. I don't think that you should be reading this text and thinking that this was an eyewitness account or that it is infallible or inerrant. It's human fingerprints all over the text. That doesn't take away from the spiritual truth in the text. The book of Joshua uses exaggeration in telling of the conquest of the Israelites. The land of Canaan was not finally conquered until the time of David. The land of Canaan was not actually conquered until the time of David. So let me go back. What Joshua does is that it paints this very neat picture of the conquest of Canaan, but it's at odds with statements elsewhere in the book of Joshua and in the book of Judges, which we'll get to in a minute. For example, in chapters 2 through 10, the victories are contained or to a very small area, which would actually be maybe the tribe of Benjamin, basically. So just one small area. In Joshua chapter 13, it opens with the statement that Joshua was old and advanced in years, and there was much of the land remaining to be possessed. And then in Joshua 10, which is in the first part of Joshua, verses 36 to 39, it reports that the conquest of several cities in the south, including Hebron and Debir. But in Judges, we read that those cities hadn't been captured. So it's kind of like, well, which is it? Did you get those cities or did you not get those cities? In the first chapter of Judges, and then later in chapter 21, we read that the people of Judah did this, meaning conquered the king of Jerusalem. And that despite that victory, they failed to actually drive out the inhabitants, the Jebusites who lived there. And so it's not until King David, like 200 years later, in fact, that we're going to read about the capture of Jerusalem. And so Judges chapter 1 gives this long list of places where the Canaanites were not expelled. And so it's not quite clear, like, why Joshua, the book of Joshua, or why the writer of Joshua, writers, because it didn't have to be a single writer, why the writers were so interested in painting this idea that the whole promised land was conquered when the archaeological evidence contradicts the picture that's in Joshua. So there are a couple of theories about how the nation state of Israel arose. And no one really knows. But what we know for sure is that the story, the way that it's depicted in Joshua, even Joshua contradicts what's in the story, meaning the book itself contradicts itself, which suggests different writers, right? And the book of Judges contradicts what's in Joshua, contradicts this picture of possessing the entire land. The archaeological evidence doesn't support it. So what gives? And so what scholars have three different models. One is this idea, this kind of immigration model. And it was first proposed by a German scholar. And it said that since the main Canaanite cities that existed in the land at the time were fortified or walled cities down on the plains, the Israelite, it's thought according to this model, would have entered and they would have occupied the very sparsely populated central highlands. And they would have slowly begun to take control of the plains down from the highlands. That's possible. That's one possibility. You know, maybe, and it could have happened somewhere maybe around the 13th century. There's some evidence for that. There's another model that suggests that a revolt model. And what this revolt model says is that Israel began really as a social revolution within Canaan. So think of like the Tea Party or, you know, any other group, it doesn't matter, but just a social revolution within Canaan. And that's how they became a separate people. And then the other one is a model of just kind of gradual emergence that says that the Israelites were basically Canaanites that developed a separate identity and settled increasingly in the central highlands. So again, there are all these different models of how it could have been. But the main thing is that Joshua doesn't tell the factual story. There's not a lot of evidence to back up Joshua, including Joshua himself or the book itself. Joshua didn't write this. Ray says, so bottom line, one has to come to their own conclusions. Yes, that's exactly it. That's exactly it. You have to read this. When I first started learning this stuff, one of the things that got me, it was like, the stuff that I've been told, well, this is what it says and this is what it is, and it was like, no, it's not. And to present it that way for me felt like lying. It just felt like a lie, and I was like, well, I can't do that. I can't do that. And then you really, like, when you get a sense of like all the different influences, for example, the fact that Joshua contradicts Joshua. Okay, like, it's not like Joshua, the writer, the school of thought that produced Joshua, wrote one story and then Joshua wrote a separate story that contradicts. You got contradictions inside the book, and so, which is evidence of additional writers, not just a single writer, and not just, say, people collaborating on a book, but that it came together through different times. And maybe this was something that the redactor or the editor did not necessarily pick up on or did not necessarily see as a problem, or maybe it wasn't the point. I don't know. BJ said, you go, Ray. Yes. So this is what Reverend Mary says. The purpose of such literary license, meaning these exaggerations, was to show that Israel was not fighting on its own. Rather, it was God that had given them the victory. Literary license is a very euphemistic way to say they made stuff up. That's a very euphemistic way to say. And again, for me, I don't see this as a reason to get rid of the Bible. I see this as a reason to be thoughtful about the Bible. That since you know this, great. And this is where the metaphysical interpretation comes in. Because if you can't depend on the story being factually true, and you decide not to throw the book away, what are you going to do with it? Incidentally, this is what the what the Greek scholars did with what we call today Greek mythology. We're familiar with the very human, anthropomorphic ways that the Greek gods behaved. Some of them behaved immorally, some of them behaved in evil ways. They were jealous. They had all kind of human characteristics. And so Greeks, studying their own god system, began to interpret those stories metaphysically. I don't think that's the word that they use, but it's essentially metaphysical interpretation. And essentially it was that there's something here. These stories have survived, and they may not be historically accurate, and they may not be factually true, but there is some value here. We're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're going to clean this bathwater up. And so metaphysical interpretation emerged not with Charles Fillmore and not with Mary Baker Eddy. This is a millennia old tradition. It emerged as a way to deal with these contradictions in the text. That when you have these disagreements in the text, what do you do with them? And if you decide, well, I'm not throwing the book away, great. Then what's our solution? And enter metaphysical interpretation as a solution to draw out the spiritual truth of the text that doesn't need the facts to be factually true. The book of Judges finds Israel in the transitional period. So we're going to switch over to the book of Judges. The book of Judges finds Israel in the transitional period after the great leadership of Moses. All right, hold on. After the great leadership of Moses. Got to get to my next set of notes. And Joshua, and before the coming era of the monarchy. After the great leadership of Moses. Remember, Moses is that paradigmatic leader. He's the dude that can do almost anything. They almost worship at the feet of Moses. And so but at this point, things are not going well. People are not getting along. They're fighting among themselves. There's just a problem. The Bible describes the early Israelite socio-political unit as the tribe. And so this was what is going to be featured in the last part of the book of Joshua. And so we see that the tribes are like these territorial units. And a tribe then is attached to a territory. And within the tribe, you have clan elders, and the clan elders are the ones who dispense justice. And so they make decisions regarding the general welfare of the tribe. And so you have that. And that now the consensus among scholars is that what you have in Canaan right now is that you have this alliance of tribes that is happening, but they're not all getting along. They're not all getting along. It is probably about from the year 1200 to the year 1000, where you got this period where they are Israel is almost trying to sort of figure out its identity. And there are all of these local tribal skirmishes that you see in the book of Judges versus, say, confrontations between nations. And there are skirmishes with groups around the country. And so it's this transition from city-states to the emerging state of what's going to be Israel. It is a transition. And so like the book of Judges, like Joshua, the book of Judges has a variety of sources that were fused together, but still honoring that those ideas from Deuteronomy of Israel being a chosen people, God being personally interested in the fate of Israel. The age of the judges was a time of threat and danger. That's what goes in that first blank. The age of the judges was a time of threat and danger. Internally, Israel seemed to be losing the faith of its ancestors. Externally, other peoples were threatening Israel with extinction. So there is a major battle. Are these people going to be able to survive? Are they going to be able to survive? Because they can't get along, they can't pull themselves together. And the thing about not being able to pull yourself together is that you then become prey for somebody who is a together force. And so there is a big concern that they won't survive this. If you go to the next page, I want to talk about the storyline for Judges. So after the death of Joshua, various forces in and around Canaan attacked the Israelites. Various forces. So they fighting themselves, they fighting other people. It's just one big old melee. And so what emerges then is this collection of individual stories that center on local heroes, several of whom are, interestingly enough, socially marginal. They are some pretty scrappy characters. I mean, you've got the illegitimate son of a prostitute, you've got a bandit, you've got a very interesting, colorful, and, basically socially marginal people. And these stories have a real folkloric flavor to them. They're just kind of full of drama and local color and local references to places and so on. And so if you were to list the stories of the various judges, there are 6 major judges, which are the ones we're going to talk about. And there are 6 minor judges. So the dire situation was caused by, this is, again, remember, this is the Deuteronomy school of thought. The reason that everything is so jacked up is because Israel is worshiping other gods rather than Yahweh. If you weren't worshiping another God, you wouldn't be in the situation that you're in. This is the Deuteronomy school of thought. And because it's presented in Judges and in Joshua, scholars see Joshua and Judges, and we'll see later with 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Samuel, that they're in the same school of thought, the same understanding of the world, basically. It's the Deuteronomistic school is what they call it. It does not mean that there was an actual school. It means that these writers are presenting a way of looking at the world that is consistent from book to book to book. And so even though it may not be the same writer writing, the perspective is the same, which is that Yahweh only ideals, no foreign marriages, no intermixing, maintaining the purity laws. This is how you uphold the law of Yahweh. A series of leaders called judges arose to deliver the Israelites. A series of leaders called judges rose to deliver the Israelites. So you have Ehud. If you look in the book, Reverend Mary lists the 6 major judges. So you have Ehud, that is in chapter 3, and it's he leads the Israelites against the Moabites. You get a lot of humor in this story. In chapters 4 and 5, you have Deborah, who helps the Israelites in battle against certain Canaanite groups. In chapters 6 through 9, you get the adventures of Gideon, and Gideon fights against the Midianites. And Gideon is interesting, and there's actually signs in his story that he is divinely chosen. There's just some evidence of the annunciation of his birth and some signal that he is divinely chosen. And then in chapter 11 and a little bit of chapter 12, you get the story of Jephthah. I don't know, it might be pronouncing that wrong. Jephthah, and he fights against the Ammonites. And this is he has a very interesting and tragic story of his daughter, which echoes similar sorts of stories in Greek legend. And then you have in chapters 13 through 16, Samson, which is probably the most popular of the judges that we know, who of course fights against the Philistines. And Samson is somewhat atypical. He has a tremendous and fatal weakness for foreign women, right? Remember, this is what gets him in trouble, is messing with these foreign women, that where he is violating the laws of Yahweh. And this is a strong theme throughout the Samson stories. And then towards the end, just some other things, just so you know, they have in chapters 17, 18, there's a story of Micah and his idolatrous shrine. And then you got a kind of a horrifying tale in chapter 19 through 20 and 21, where the story of the Levites' concubine and the civil war. And so these stories have been embedded in a Deuteronomistic framework. And this framework is that Yahweh only ideal, Yahweh only worship. And every time they get in trouble, they turn from Yahweh. It's the same story. You could almost write the story yourself. What did they do? They got involved in some way with somebody else's God. They stopped worshiping Yahweh only, and now they're in trouble. And it is, it's just, it's like they can't learn their lessons. There are Israelite intertribal conflicts, and you see those, that's what I talked about in chapters 17 to 21. The 12 judges, I think it's important, they're not judicial figures, but they're really defenders of Israel, almost like military leaders. They were commissioned with a specific task, and they only arise in times of national crisis. So they're not a judge like in a judicial sense in the way that we think about it. The judge would have a charismatic quality, which in several cases you'll see in the book of Judges, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. And so God would raise up the judge to deliver the people from a specific crisis. And the judge might muster troops from 2 tribes or 3 tribes, or sometimes only a clan or 2, which suggests that there was really no real national entity at this particular time. But the institution of judges, it never created like a fixed political form. So each judge differed from the last in background and class and even gender. You have Deborah, who was the one female judge, and she did exercise judicial functions, evidently, according to the text. But the judges weren't chosen because of their virtue. They weren't chosen because they were good people. Many of them fall into the literary type of trickster, kind of like Jacob was, where he tricks his brother out of his birthright. They were crafty, tricky types. Gideon is explicitly chosen for his weakness and not because of his strength. But it turns out that he's quite a ruthless fighter, and he's clearly not a devout Yahwist. Jephthah is an outlaw. Samson is hardly a moral example. So they're not really meant to be idealized heroes, but they're just kind of popular heroes. They're like our celebrities today. That's what you can think of. They salacious people. When they come out with the stories about them from TMZ, it's like, well, what would you expect, right? So anyway, now I said this before, but virtually every story follows the following outline. Every judge story, the minor and the major judges, that Israel, that's what goes in that first blank, turns from Yahweh somehow or some way. An enemy oppresses Israel. So if you think about Samson, it was the Philistines. Remember, the Philistines oppressed Israel. Israel cries for help, and then Yahweh sends a judge to deliver Israel. It's like a loop. They can't learn their lessons. And that is it for our conversation today on Judges. Any question on the Judges? Any question on the Judges, or any question on Joshua? Any aha moments? Anything you heard differently for the first time? What do you think about the Bible? Maybe I should ask that as I'm sharing this. I know what I think. I know learning this in an odd way made me excited about the Bible. It made me want to know more. But what is this doing for you? Ray says, thank God for metaphysical interpretation. Yes. What is this doing for you when you hear about this? Is this a faith shaker for you? Does it strengthen your faith? How is it impacting you?
Robin?
Yes. Hi, PJ.
Hi. I just want to say, you asking how is it impacting me?
Yes.
Girl, Robin. And see, I think you don't even know this. See, I am a senior citizen.
Yes,
and
ma'am.
I've been running for Christ for years. I was a missionary.
Woo!
But Robin, oh my goodness. You talking about taking a different look, a different perspective?
Yes.
Expanding my territory? Ooh, Lord, thank you. I'm thinking, thank you.
Yes. Saba says, I am enjoying this in-depth study of the Bible. Good. The something that I'll share this with you guys. I guess technically I'm sharing it with the world on YouTube. But July 5th, I got the clearest direction I think I've ever gotten in any of my listening for God. And it said I am to preserve, protect, progress, and pass on the art and science of metaphysical Bible interpretation. And I was like, that's a big job, first of all. And second of all, how? And third of all, okay, And fourth of all, it just was like one of those like really, like me, okay. And because I've always said this, this teaching of metaphysical Bible interpretation has been passed down for centuries. It's not new. It didn't start with Fillmore. It didn't start with Mary Baker Eddy or anybody else. That it's been traveling through time. You can go back to St. Augustine, one of the church fathers in Northern Africa, that, and find in his writings where he does metaphysical Bible interpretation. And it's been viewed in different ways. And at this season, it has landed in our laps, meaning us with the Universal Foundation for Better Living. And that's just interesting to me. That's fascinating to me. And to my knowledge, there's no one else on the planet that's doing this kind of work. There are people who read metaphysical interpretation, but I'm talking about a school that is teaching others how to do it. I don't mean just people who are dabbling in it as a hobby, because you could find some fancy, Sherri, some celebrities that are like delving into it. One of my favorite people to listen is KRS-One. I just dig that brother, and he needs to come on and hang out at the Bible Hangout with us one Thursday night. You can find people that do it, but you don't find schools that are passing it on as a way of study. And so it's with us. And so the question I kept asking is that, is it going to die out on our watch? And on July 5th, Spirit said to me, that was a question for you. As I heard, and I've been asking everybody else, and the question was intended for me. And I was like, oh. So anyway, I find that fascinating. So I pray for me, because I am seeking to answer that question and to fulfill that call, and to make sure that 1,000 years from now, they will read about this community of people in Los Angeles, California, and the U.S. who said yes to this way of studying Scripture and passed it down to later generations. So, any other questions? Any other thoughts? Stuff that came to you while I'm still baby free? George's about to show up in a few minutes.
Yeah, can you hold that just a few more minutes? I think one more person may have something.
Yeah, I'm good.
I think they're trying to get to you.
Well, that's me. I have something I wanted to say. I was trying. Thank you, Ms. BJ. I was over here trying to click my little microphone.
Okay.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Sam.
I had said something in the chat box, but I think it needs a little bit more explanation, but orally.
Yes.
I said that you have answered the question about why one would want to understand the Bible, but what I was really meant is, because I'm doing all of this learning, this metaphysical learning of the Bible, and I run into these thoughts of, why am I studying this anyway? And if it's not literal, why am I studying this anyway? But tonight, you really opened up some doors for me that explains why you would still want to learn what happened, understand what the people were dealing with of that day, and how we apply it in our lives today, which is what you allow us to do by reminding us of, you keep taking us back, God, remember, this is a different time. This is not the time that we're in now. And, making those correlations. So I'm appreciating it. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you
for
so
saying
much.
yes.
What is funny to me, and it tells you how much. So one of the things that Reverend Mary was big on was getting into the academy. And she felt like we needed to be in that conversation. And one of my favorite books is a book by Marcus Borg called Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. And that might be a good book for us to take a look at. And he's not doing metaphysical interpretation. In fact, he doesn't have any awareness of, he's dead now, but in his lifetime had no real awareness of metaphysical interpretation. And he, in the book, and I'd have to go get up and search for the book, but in the book, he brings up St. Augustine, either Origin or St. Augustine, I can't remember which one. And he talks about their interpretation of scripture. And he was saying, but yeah, you know, they went too far. But because I know what metaphysical Bible interpretation, as soon as I looked at what he wrote, I was like, that's classic metaphysical Bible interpretation. This symbolizes that, that symbolizes this means that, and the interaction of these different things. And so this type of interpretation has been going on for centuries. It's not new, but it's been in the background. At other times it was in secret societies. You know, fortunately we don't have to be in secret societies to do this type of study anymore. But it is a, you know, it's a little known form of study. And the moment you say it and people hear metaphysical and they get scared and they think voodoo and hoodoo and all kind of other stuff. Ray says it's the only intelligent method of studying scripture. It makes perfect sense. It speaks to my soul. And Jonathan said, yes, please let's study a Marcus Borg book. I am reading Jesus, a New Vision book. Okay. Yvonne says, I was surprised you didn't really mention Deuteronomy 68 last week, which coincides with Abraham's 400-year prophecy, which deals with our modern day issues. I don't know about that. You got to tell me about that, Yvonne. Hello. Yvonne, are you there? If you're able to unmute yourself, because I don't know about that.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, there you are. I can hear you now. Go ahead.
Sorry, I've got too many windows open. No, in Deuteronomy 68, it talks about the blessings and curses. You did talk about that in general, but 68 brings up, I'll read it. And the Lord shall bring thee unto Egypt again with ships, by the way whereof I spake unto thee. Thou shalt see it no more again, and there you shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondswomen, and no man shall buy you. What other group of people have been taken away from a land by ships? A lot of interpretation, the U.S. is considered the second Egypt. So they said Egypt again. So, and so, and then if people have been listening, there's a big thing about 1619 when the first enslaved people came in. Well, there's a lot of studies going on. When was that 400? Because in Abraham, I think in Exodus, he talks about the 400 years. So that's the 400-year prophecy. And so apparently when the 400 years is up, I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. So 1619, this is now 2019, the 400 years is up. So it's kind of like the curse is over. Yes.
Just
a thought.
No. So what's powerful about that is a lot of things. One, did we talk about Anthony Browder and his work?
No. Oh wait.
Okay, I thought we did. When we got together. Okay. Well, anyway, so Anthony Browder. So first of all, there's a couple things I want to do. I want to sponsor a trip to Kansas City because I want to just go do a retreat at Unity Village. So I'm going to put that together, and whoever wants to come hang out with me. But secondly, I want to go do a trip to Washington, D.C. Anthony Browder has a tour called Egypt on the Potomac. And so exactly to what you're talking about, that America is like the new Egypt. The founding fathers, when they were creating DC, they literally mapped it out to be an exact replica of Egypt. And everything is placed. And so the reason Anthony discovered this is that he was an architecture man. I think he went to Howard, and he's from Chicago, and he does all this work in architecture. But he had the eye of an architect. You know, the same way that when I saw what Marcus Borg was saying about origin and like laughing about it, it's like, no, that's too far. I'm like, no, that's classic metaphysical interpretation, but because I've been trained in how to do that. So Anthony, because he has been trained as an architect, when he went to Egypt and then came back to DC where he had been in college, he started looking and seeing all of these things, but he was looking with an architect's eye. And so the more he delved into it, he started he started discovering all of these places where basically the construction of the country is built on this idea of creating the new Egypt. And he does a tour called Egypt on the Potomac. And so I want to go and take that tour and go back to that museum that I love.
Oh, I would love to take that tour. That
Yes. And Andrea says, in all honesty, Rev, I really don't feel the Old Testament. I prefer the teachings of love, Christ, and enlightenment of the New Testament. Yet you make it interesting enough for me to keep logging in. Thank you, Andrea. Did you want to say anything else about that? Because I definitely, that may represent what somebody else is feeling as well. Saber says ditto. So one of the things about the Hebrew scriptures, we should get out of saying Old Testament because this is still somebody's Bible. That's a Christian way of looking at it. The Hebrew scriptures, that these stories, that is a Christian way of looking at the Hebrew scriptures, is as this way of living that is legalistic. If you could see it like Greek mythology and take off of it all the pressure of you got to believe it the way that it's written and it's an inerrant word of God and it's infallible. If we could lift those strictures off, then we can explore these stories and see that these people are trying to understand this power and this presence. And one of the things that came to me today, and I'll say this and then we can go unless somebody has something else they want to offer, that this idea of obeying Yahweh or else. I really have a hard time seeing that any different from saying that follow spiritual law or you get the consequences of not following spiritual law. And it was their language and their way of talking about it. But I know that, it is no different from saying, listen, the law of attraction is the law of attraction. You attract what you think about. Well, I got this man in my life and he's this and he's that. And it's like, well, what are you thinking? Because your thinking is creating your experience. It's just as black and white. This was their way of talking about this understanding of their relationship with the universe. Our relationship with the universe is that we understand that what I think about, I bring about. That what goes on in my mind becomes an expression in my life. If I want to change what's going on in my life, I've got to change what's happening in my mind. Now, they have personified God. So I think that makes it a little hard to maybe see the parallel, but it's no different from saying, listen, your thinking is what took you out of where you are, or your thinking is what put you where you are. If there's any sin, the sin is in the thinking. Am I thinking in alignment with what God wants for me? Am I thinking in alignment with God is all there is? Because if I'm not, I'm getting the results of that kind of thought. I'm getting that mixed consciousness. And so, anyway, I just want to throw that out there that as I was, studying today, it was really getting how much like this ancient group of people who are trying to understand the universe in their own way we are.
Thanks, Rev. I appreciate that. I come from this whole Church of God in Christ background where the rules were laid down so hard, and I just feel so free with the metaphysics, of Christ and and oneness, that I resonate with that. And that Old Testament just smacks so hard of the upbringing that is, I feel resistant to it. You know, I appreciate it though. The way you bring it, I like.
Yeah. Thank you, Andrea.
Andrea,
Yes.
she really brings it.
Doesn't she?
The thing is that
Yeah. I wouldn't even be listening if it was brought by somebody else.
there you go. And the Reverend, she needs to hear that. And the thing is that as we share, we grow, we develop.
Yes.
We all get a better understanding. It's just, like I say, you just expanding your territory.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
So, you know, I mean, I agree with everything, but I'm willing to listen.
Yes.
And now I can ask questions.
Yes. Yes.
And it's all right if we don't agree.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Thank you.
So, I love you guys.
We love you.
This is my favorite thing in the whole wide world. Hang out with y'all on Thursday night. All right. So next week we're gonna do Samuel, the books of Samuel, the books of Samuel, and the books of Kings. Now those are a little bit longer, so we will probably split that into 2 classes. Yeah, we're gonna have to, because we're gonna go through. We're gonna hit Samuel, the prophet Samuel. We're gonna hit Elisha, Elijah. We've got a few different cycles we've got to go through. So it's going to take us from, it's going to take us from page 49 to page 61. So that's 2 classes at least, possibly 3, but 2 or 3 classes. So the books of Samuel, so page 49 to 61, and I'll try to do 2 classes so we can keep going. So, all right. Thank you guys. I do want to give you a date that's coming up. I'm going to find out on Sunday, but I'm pretty certain that I'm going back to Sacramento. And so I'm going to try to see if I can schedule what I do on Thursday earlier so that we can start later. So I got to work on that. And thank you, Constance. I'm looking for your homework. I have one to give back to you, so I'll send that back to you tonight. So thank you so much. I love and appreciate you guys. And I will see you guys next week. And I'll be announcing the new challenge, Metaphysical Bible Challenge for September. That's coming up. So please look out for that. All right. Good night, guys. Have a great week.